Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a really fascinating case today, the story of Juan Corona.
Yeah.
For this one, we're using excerpts from his Wikipedia article. And you guys have been asking for an in-depth look at Corona for a while, so here we go.
It's a heavy one, for
Right.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a man who was convicted of murdering 25 migrant workers in California back in 1971.
Yeah, he was considered like America's deadliest serial killer for a time.
And even after all these years, it's a case that still raises a lot of questions.
Right, like about the nature of evil, the vulnerabilities of marginalized people.
Right. And the complexities of the justice system.
Yeah.
It's a tough one for sure.
So let's start with who Juan Corona was.
Okay.
He was born in Mexico in 1934
Right.
and came to the United States, I guess following his family to California when he was 16.
Yeah, that's right. And that actually wasn't his first time in the U.S.
Oh, right.
Yeah, he had come here illegally in 1950.
Yeah.
But he was deported back to Mexico after something happened in 1956.
Yeah, that's right. He was committed to a mental hospital that year.
Exactly.
And they diagnosed him with schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type.
Wow.
Which,
That's intense.
I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. And he also received electroconvulsive therapy
Right.
before he was deported.
Yeah, this was obviously a pivotal moment in his life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But he didn't stay in Mexico. He was able to come back to the U.S. legally in 1962
Okay. Yeah.
after getting a green card and everything.
Huh.
Settled in California again.
Mhm.
Became a labor contractor, which meant that he was working directly with
Oh, yeah.
migrant farm workers.
And that's going to
Yeah.
come into play later, obviously. Yeah.
Huge.
But before we get to the murders, there's another event in 1970 where he's admitted to a mental hospital again.
Yeah.
So this is like
Yeah,
a recurring thing for him.
definitely. Seems to be a pattern.
Yeah. And then just a year later, in 1971,
He was denied welfare.
and shortly after, that's when the murders start. So it's like, it's unsettling how it just like aligns like that. It seems like, you start to
Yeah, it's hard not to. It's hard not to think that those things
draw a connection.
are related somehow.
Yeah. But of course, we want to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Good.
So let's actually get into the crimes now.
Okay.
So walk us through those first few discoveries. What happened?
Well, in May of 1971, a peach farm owner in Sutter County, California, found something really disturbing.
Okay.
He found a freshly dug hole in his orchard that had been filled in.
Mm-hmm.
And when they investigated, it turned out to be a grave
Oh my God.
with a man's body inside who had been stabbed and hacked to death.
So that's like the
Yeah.
beginning
The start of it all.
of this huge investigation, and they started looking
Right.
for more.
Well, so the police,
All right.
obviously, they launched this full-scale investigation.
Right.
And as they start searching, they're finding more bodies,
Uh-huh.
all buried in shallow graves in these orchards.
Mm.
And they ended up finding a total of 25 victims.
Like, it's hard to fathom
It's
that, like,
It's a lot.
scale. Yeah. So how did they even begin to, like,
Yeah.
connect Juan Corona to these crimes? Like, what was the
Yeah, you
first piece of...
remember he was a labor contractor.
Right.
So he interacted with a lot of these migrant workers regularly.
Okay.
And during the investigation, they found meat receipts and bank deposit slips
Uh-huh.
in some of the graves
Okay.
with Corona's name on them.
So that basically puts him
Now, that's pretty dang.
at the scene. Yeah.
Right.
Were there any witnesses who saw him with the victims?
Yes, actually. Several witnesses came forward
Oh, wow.
and said that they had seen some of the victims in Corona's truck
Okay.
in the days before they disappeared.
So, like, this is
Yeah.
really starting to come together.
It's all coming together. And then the most incriminating evidence was found. When they searched Corona's home,
What did they find?
they found blood-stained knives, a machete, a pistol, clothing with blood on it,
Oh,
and a work ledger.
a work ledger. What's so incriminating about that?
Well, this wasn't just any work ledger. It had names and dates in it,
Okay.
including the names of 7 of the victims.
Oh, wow.
So the prosecution called it his death list at the trial.
So they have a potential murder weapon
Right.
and what looks like a list of victims.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the victims themselves? Like, did they have anything in common? Was there a pattern?
Yeah, all 25 victims were middle-aged Caucasian males.
Mm. Okay.
Most of them were transient workers, kind of drifters.
Mm.
A lot of them had criminal records, which actually, this kind of victim selection
Yeah.
is pretty common in serial killer cases.
Yeah, they often target people who are, like, on the fringes of society,
Right.
whose disappearances might go unnoticed.
Exactly. People who might not have, like,
Right.
strong social connections. Most of them were killed with a knife or a machete, although one of the victims
Mm-hmm.
was shot in the head.
Okay.
And there's one other interesting thing about the victims.
What's that?
Their ages.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that in the source
Yeah.
material.
Yeah, they were all
Oh.
within a pretty specific age range,
Right.
between 40 and 64.
Okay.
Most of them were between 47 and 64.
So that's like a...
Yeah, so it could suggest that he was targeting a particular type of
Yeah,
victim.
that's helpful for profiling and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's, with the evidence mounting against him, what happened when he was arrested? What were the legal proceedings like?
So he was initially assigned a public defender, but he later decided to switch to a private attorney
Okay.
named Richard Hawk. And that actually
Mm-hmm.
came back to haunt him later.
Why? What was the issue with that?
As part of his fee, Richard Hawk secured exclusive rights to Corona's life story.
I can see how that would raise some
You can imagine.
ethical questions.
Yeah, there's a huge conflict of interest there.
Yeah, like the attorney representing you is going to profit off of your
Right.
story, so that's
Yeah.
a little messed up.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the first trial. When did that begin?
So the trial started in September of 1972, and it was moved to Solano County
Okay.
just to ensure a fairer trial.
Right, because it was such a
Yeah, it was a huge
media sensation.
media circus.
So how did the trial actually play out? Like, did Corona testify?
No, Corona didn't testify.
Right.
And here's the thing. His attorney, Richard Hawk,
Yeah.
didn't call any defense witnesses at all,
Wow.
which is
no witness.
pretty unusual.
Like, he didn't try to offer another explanation or anything?
No, it was a bold strategy.
Yeah, and I guess it didn't work.
No. In January of 1973, the jury found him guilty
Wow.
on all 25 counts of first-degree murder.
So what was the sentence?
He was sentenced to 25 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.
So that's like...
Yeah.
It seems like a pretty open and shut case.
It felt like justice had been served.
Yeah.
But, I mentioned earlier
Right.
that change in attorney came back to bite him.
Right.
And that's because...
Oh, so it wasn't over?
Oh, no.
Oh.
His legal troubles were not over.
So what happened?
So he was attacked in prison
Oh.
by another inmate, lost an eye. And then in 1978,
Okay.
his conviction was overturned.
What?
Yeah.
After all that, like, why? How, on what grounds?
Because the appeals court determined that he had received inadequate legal representation
Oh.
during his first trial.
You mean because of the Richard Hawk,
Yeah, that whole
life story thing?
thing, yeah. The court saw that as a huge conflict of interest. And they basically said that his defense was compromised.
So they overturned it.
They overturned it.
Because of that.
Yeah,
And he gets a new trial.
he gets a new trial.
That's insane.
Yeah. And that second trial brings a whole other set of twists and turns.
Wow. Okay.
But we'll talk about that in the next part of our deep dive.
So we'll leave you with that cliffhanger for now. It's amazing how this case, that seems so open and shut,
It did.
took such a turn. But we'll be back to talk about the second trial and the rest of Juan Corona's story soon.
Definitely. So we left off with Juan Corona getting a new trial, and his defense team this time took a totally different approach.
Yeah. What was their strategy this time around?
They decided to try to pin the murders on someone else.
Oh, really?
Corona's half-brother, Natividad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Natividad had fled back to Mexico
Uh-huh.
after an assault charge. And the defense argued that he was the real killer.
Interesting. So what was their, what evidence did they use to support this claim? Like, what was Natividad's background like?
Well, they pointed to his history of violence and kind of like erratic behavior.
Okay.
They also brought up that he was a known homosexual, and suggested that that might have been a motive,
I mean...
since all the victims were male.
Right.
And back then,
Yeah. Times were different.
societal attitudes were very different towards homosexuality.
Yeah.
So,
It's a little unsettling that they use that as part of their argument.
it is. It is.
But did it work?
Not really. The jury didn't buy it.
Okay.
But there was another twist in this second trial.
What's that?
Remember how Corona stayed silent during his first trial?
Yeah, his lawyer didn't even call any witnesses or anything. It was
Right.
pretty bizarre.
Well, this time, Corona actually testified.
He did. Oh, wow. He finally decided to speak.
He did.
What did he say?
Not much. He only answered 2 questions.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
The first one was just to confirm that he understood the charges against him.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, he just straight up denied any involvement in the murders.
So even when he spoke, he still remained a mystery.
Pretty much, yeah.
What was the outcome of this second trial?
Well, the jury deliberated for 54 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
And then they came back with a verdict. Guilty.
Wow.
Again, Juan Corona was found guilty on all 25 counts of first-degree murder.
So they got him again.
They got him again.
Yeah.
Justice prevailed. But it was a long road.
Yeah, it really was.
So what happened to him after this second conviction?
Yeah, what happened next?
Well, he was transferred to a different prison in 1992. He was denied parole 8 times.
Uh-huh.
And then,
Okay.
in 2011,
Yeah.
during a parole hearing,
Okay.
something pretty remarkable happened.
What was that? I'm on the edge of my seat.
He confessed.
He confessed.
He confessed to the murders.
After all those years of, like, saying he was innocent?
I know. It's crazy.
That's wild. What made him change his mind after all that time?
Well, there's a catch.
Okay.
By this point, he was suffering from dementia.
Oh. So it's, like,
So it's hard to know
not reliable.
if it was a genuine confession or
Yeah. Like the ramblings of someone who's,
whose mind is deteriorating.
Yeah.
It adds another layer of complexity to the case.
It really does, yeah. It's like, was he really in control of his actions or?
Right. Was he a victim of the system?
Yeah. Was he capable of, like, understanding what was happening to him? And
Right. Of even comprehending the legal proceedings.
yeah.
It's tough.
It's a really gray area.
Yeah, these are questions that, legal scholars and ethicists still debate.
Yeah. Like, where do we draw the line between accountability and compassion?
Exactly.
Yeah. It's hard.
Yeah.
So,
What was the final chapter in his story?
yeah. What happened to him?
He died in prison in 2019
Okay.
of natural causes at the age of 85. So his death kind of brought an end to this.
Yeah.
Life full of darkness and mystery.
It's crazy to think that even with 2 guilty verdicts,
Yeah.
there are still so many questions. Like, why? Why did he do it?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
It's what keeps people fascinated by this case, I think.
Yeah.
Even today.
Yeah. It's like,
The brutality, the crimes,
yeah.
the vulnerability of the victims,
Mm-hmm.
all the twists and turns.
Yeah. And the mystery of his motives. It's
Yeah.
like a puzzle that
Yeah.
we're still trying to,
I mean, never solve.
yeah, solve it.
Yeah.
It also forces us to kind of confront uncomfortable truths
Absolutely.
about our society.
About how we treat.
Like the exploitation of migrant workers.
Right.
The way we view mental illness. Like,
The flaws in our justice system.
all these things
Yeah.
came to light during this case.
Big time.
And there's still issues that we're dealing with
Yeah.
today, which is why this case still resonates with people.
Absolutely. It's a reminder
Decades later.
that history can repeat itself
Mm-hmm.
and that we have a responsibility to learn from the past.
Yeah.
If we want to create a better future.
And speaking of the past, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the media coverage of this case. Like,
Oh.
this was one of the first serial killer cases
Huge.
to get
Yeah.
national attention.
It was a media sensation.
Yeah.
Everybody was talking about it.
I mean, newspapers, TV networks.
Yeah. They were broadcasting live from the orchards,
Yeah.
interviewing witnesses,
Yeah.
speculating about motives.
Yeah.
It was,
A whole new level of media frenzy.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
And while that did bring it to the forefront of, public consciousness, it probably had some negative effects too.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely fueled public anxieties about migrant workers,
Right?
and probably reinforced some harmful stereotypes.
Yeah. And imagine like being a family member of one of the victims
Oh, my God.
and having to grieve
Yeah,
while this media circus is going on around you.
absolutely. Their pain
Yeah.
was often overshadowed by the focus on the killer,
Yeah.
which it raises a lot of ethical questions.
Right. Like, are we exploiting these people's pain for entertainment?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah. It's important to remember that behind the headlines. Yeah.
There are real people.
These lives have been shattered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, before we get to the final part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to talk about the crime scenes themselves.
Yeah.
We're talking about 25 bodies buried in shallow graves across different orchards.
Yeah.
Like, how did investigators even begin to process such a massive and complex crime scene?
Right. It was an immense undertaking.
Yeah.
You can just imagine.
Like excavating all those graves,
Yeah.
identifying the victim.
Gathering evidence. And this was, you know,
Yeah.
before DNA technology.
Right. So they had to rely on
Right. Fingerprints, blood typing.
school methods.
Ballistic. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was really a turning point for forensic science, I think.
Yeah.
Really pushed the boundaries of what was possible at the time. And speaking of pushing boundaries,
Okay.
let's talk about the psychology of Juan Corona.
Yeah. Let's dive into that. Like, what might have driven him to commit such horrific acts?
Right. So we know he had that diagnosis. Right. Schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type.
Right.
From his time in the mental hospital.
From the mental hospitals. And there was a history of mental illness in his family.
Okay.
Remember, his half-brother also showed signs of violence and strange behavior.
Right. So mental illness was definitely a factor.
Right.
But, like,
what extent?
Was it the only thing?
Yeah.
Or were there other things going on?
Or was there something else? You know?
Yeah.
Experts ever come up with, like, a psychological profile of him?
Yeah.
Well, experts have put forward different theories over the years.
Like what?
Some people think that his mental illness combined with, you know, stressors in his life.
Yeah.
Like his financial problems.
Right. He was denied welfare. And
the welfare rejection.
Yeah.
Maybe that pushed him over the edge.
Okay.
Other people have speculated that he might have had, like, underlying rage or a need for power and control.
Okay. But it's hard to know for sure.
We may never know.
Yeah.
It's like we're missing some pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, and the picture they create is still blurry.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're left with more questions than answers.
Exactly.
And that's what makes the Juan Corona case so intriguing.
I think so.
Even after all this time.
Yeah. It's a reminder that the human mind is capable of both great good and unspeakable evil.
Okay, so we've talked about Corona's life,
the
crimes, the trials, his psychology. But there's one big question we haven't really answered, like, what was his motive? Why did he do it?
Yeah, it's the question everyone wants to know. And unfortunately, we might never have a definitive answer.
Right. We've discussed all the theories, but there's no real consensus.
No.
I mean, we know he had a history of mental illness, and he was facing, like, financial problems. But was there something more to it?
Some experts have suggested that maybe there was a homophobic element to the crimes.
Oh.
You know, all the victims were men. And remember, his half-brother, who the defense tried to blame, was gay.
Right.
So, it's a disturbing thought. But it's something to consider.
I mean, we have to consider all possibilities.
Right.
Was there any actual evidence to support that, though?
Not really. I mean, there's no direct evidence to connect his actions to homophobia.
Okay.
So it's just speculation at this point.
Right. We have to be careful about distinguishing between actual evidence and just theories.
Absolutely.
What about the idea that he targeted these men because they were vulnerable? Like, a lot of them were transient workers, drifters, people who wouldn't necessarily have strong social connections.
Right. People who might slip through the cracks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a more plausible explanation. It fits with what we know about serial killers.
Right.
And how they choose their victims. They often prey on people who are marginalized.
Yeah.
Overlooked by society.
It's a scary thought. But it's a reminder that we need to look out for each other. You know, create support systems for those who are most vulnerable.
Especially.
And in this case, these victims were already facing so many challenges as migrant workers.
Right. Living in poverty.
Yeah.
Struggling to survive.
Yeah, like a...
And then this happens.
Tragedy on top of a tragedy.
Yeah. And it points to these larger issues that were at play.
Like the poverty, the inequality, the exploitation of these workers.
It creates this kind of breeding ground for violence.
Yeah.
You know, when people are desperate, things can happen.
It's a reminder that crime doesn't just happen out of nowhere.
Oh.
There's always a context.
Right. It's all connected.
Yeah.
To social and economic factors.
Right. So if we want to prevent this from happening again, we have to understand those root causes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The Juan Corona case is a powerful example of that.
For sure.
So where does this leave us? We've talked about Juan Corona.
Yeah.
His crimes, the trials.
We've covered a lot.
The psychology. But we're still left with a lot of unanswered questions.
And I think that's part of what makes this case so fascinating.
Right. It's like a puzzle we can't quite solve.
Exactly. A story that keeps unfolding in our minds.
Yeah. Even after all these years.
Yeah.
It's a story that makes us think about some really difficult things.
Yeah. Like, what is evil? How does mental illness play a role? How do we protect the most vulnerable people in our society?
Yeah, those are important questions to ask.
Good questions.
So if you want to learn more about Juan Corona and this case, we encourage you to check out the books that are mentioned in his Wikipedia article.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
Definitely. And as always, keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Question everything.
Yeah.
Seek out different perspectives.
And never stop searching for the truth.
That's what it's all about.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
It was a tough one.
It was.
But an important one.
For sure.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those minds open.
Absolutely.